Kritik teks Alkitab. Apakah manuskrip Perjanjian Baru bisa diandalkan? Dua pendapat yang bertolak belakang.
Para polemikus Muslim, mereka merujuk kepada varian-varian tekstual itu terutama sebagai alasan untuk mendukung asumsi tanpa dasar mereka bahwa Alkitab itu sudah diselewengkan, sudah dikorupsi dalam arti konten teologisnya, itu sudah disimpangkan. Seakan-akan orang Kristen ini kok niat banget ya untuk menipu, niat banget untuk menyimpangkan kitab suci. Dan ekstrim semacam itu biasanya lahir dari orang-orang goblok.
At Moody Bible Institute, I believed, as did my professors, that the Bible is without error in the autographs. In other words, the originals. The problem is, we don't have the originals of the New Testament. What we have are thousands of copies of the New Testament that were made, in most cases, centuries later. These copies that were made centuries later contain numerous mistakes, thousands of mistakes, tens of thousands of mistakes, hundreds of thousands of mistakes. At some point, I came to the realization that my belief in the inerrancy of the autographs didn't make sense. If God inspired the Bible without error, why hadn't He preserved the Bible without error? I couldn't any longer believe that God had inspired the originals because I was sure He had not preserved the original. We cannot know whether the Gospels have been preserved accurately through the ages, and I'm going to try and illustrate with you by explaining how it worked. Take the Gospel of Mark. Whenever Mark was written, say it was written in the year 65 or in the year 70, in the city of Rome, say, I don't know where it was made. Whoever wrote Mark put it in circulation and somebody copied the Gospel of Mark. Then somebody copied that copy and somebody copied the copy of the copy. Then somebody copied the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy. And we don't have any of those copies. Everybody who copied the text made mistakes. Our first surviving copy of Mark probably dates to around the year 220 AD. That is, 150 years after Mark was first produced. Our first complete copy of Mark comes from the year 350, about 280 years after Mark. We have lots of copies from later times. From thousands of years, 1,000 years after Mark, we get lots of copies. When you compare all of these copies with one another, they all differ from one another. And what is striking is the earlier you go to look at the manuscripts, the more differences you find. The earliest copies have the most mistakes. What would happen if we found copies that were still earlier? The only evidence we have is the evidence that survives, which suggests that in the early periods of copying, there was the most mistakes made. How many were made the first month, or the first year, or the first decade? How many mistakes were made in the copy of the copy of the copy, which served as the copy of all the copies that we now have? We have no way of knowing. If Craig thinks that we have a way of knowing how the gospel was changed in its first 100 years, I want to know what the answer is, because I've worked on this problem for 30 years, and I don't know of a way to know, and I've never seen a good explanation. You can't argue that that we have lots and lots of copies of Mark, and therefore we know what was originally in Mark. These lots and lots of copies are from many centuries after Mark was written. How could we know that these copies stem from a correct copy instead of an errant copy? Our earliest ones are all highly errant.